Hi, my name is Brandy Fairnot, and my project is on the medical staff members needed per state for the upcoming influenza season. The motivation of this project stems from hospitals and clinics that need additional staffing to adequately treat the extra patients that they get during the flu season. The medical staff agency that we are working with is trying to provide temporary staff during those high months where influenza usually peaks, and we need to determine how many nursing staff members need to go to each state. The hypothesis of this project is if a patient is over 65 years of age, then we believe that they'll be more likely to succumb to an influenza diagnosis. The objective of this project is one, where should we send the staff and how many staff are going to be needed per state? Of course, it may not be a perfect number, but we want to try to get as close as possible based on all the analysis that we did. The bottom chart is from the CDC and it shows us the peak months for influenza. As you can see, it's usually around October and it takes its dive usually in April. The peak months that we want to pay attention to are going to be those winter months, so December, January, February, and March when it starts to get cold. This next slide is of the influenza deaths versus the population totals. So there are a couple of graphs here. You'll see three, and the two at the top are maps, and they show influenza deaths make up a smaller portion compared to the populations for each state. So what you'll see here on the chart to the left is a chart of each state, and it is color coded based on the population for each state from 2009 all the way to 2017. We can see that the darker colors have more population and the lighter colors have less of a population between those years. So for instance, if we're looking at California, we can see that the population from 2009 all the way to 2017 was about 38 million people. When you come over here to the chart on the right, we're looking at the influenza death totals from 2009 all the way to 2017, and the color coding is pretty similar to where the lighter colors mean that information for the death totals is lower compared to the darker color where the influenza death totals are higher. Once again, you can see that California is one of the darker colored states, and when you hover over that state, you can see the death totals for 5 to 64 years of age. You can also see 65 plus years for the death, and then you can also see the influenza death total. So for California, you see the death total is only about 54,000 people between 2009 and 2017. And once again, looking back at that chart on the left, the total population of California from 2009 to 2017 was 38 million. So once again, 54,000 compared to 38 million is a drop in a bucket. Down here at the bottom, we have a bar chart that's going to display the influenza death by age and by state. So at the bottom is going to show you each state, and you'll see the number of total deaths at the top of each bar chart. And when you hover over the bar chart, it'll tell you the state name, as well as age groups from 5 all the way to 85 plus years of age, and how many deaths they had for that state. And this is for the complete years of 2009 to 2017. I can come over here to my highlight states, and if I want to see something about maybe California, since that's the one that we focused on, I can click there, and you can see that on each of my maps, it highlights California to make it a little bit easier for me if I wasn't sure where the states were on the map. And here at the bottom of my bar chart, you can see it also highlights that bar of where it is. And as you see, because it is the highest total of deaths for all the states between 2009 and 2017, that it is highlighted first. For this slide, how does the 65 plus age group fare? We are focusing on our hypothesis. So our hypothesis focuses on the 65 plus age and up group being more vulnerable to influenza. So the graph on the left, which is A graph of the United States shows the top 10 states that had the most influenza deaths per our data. So as you can see in this chart over here, we have once again the color coding of the states, with the lighter colors being less death totals of 65 plus age groups, and the darker colors being like a blue. Those states have more of a death total for influenza states from 2009 to 2017. So once again, we can look at California as an example. You can see it does tell us the name of that state along with the different age groups that our data provided for us. So you can see that 65 to 74 years of age had about 7,000 deaths between 2009 and 2017. 75 to 84 years of age had about 13,000. 85 plus years of age had over 26,000 deaths for influenza. And what that shows us for those age groups, once they get to 85 plus, they have more likelihood of dying due to influenza diagnosis. And if I go to any other state, for instance, Texas, you can see that the 85 years of age is higher than the 65 to 74 and the 75 to 84 age range. Same thing with New York. The 85 is higher. North Carolina, same. Tennessee is the same. Florida is the same. And just to be transparent, all of them are going to be the same. No matter what state you go to, that 85 plus age range is always the highest for these states that are the top 10. The graph on your right is going to be the percentage of influenza deaths against the total state population by year. We just want to know, okay, for 65 plus years of age, did they have a higher percentage of death totals compared to those younger ages of 65 and under when it comes to the total population? Because, like we said before, California had a higher number of deaths from any other state, but the 54,000 deaths that they had compared to the 38 million population is almost nothing. So as you see here, we just put it into a percentage chart. So the legend at the bottom shows you which age range is for which color on the line chart above. And as you can see, I have my percentages on the left, and at the bottom we have each year. And there's a significant difference for 85 plus compared to any other age group. So the 85 plus age group is closer to 20%. Even at its lowest, which was in 2016, they had a percentage of about 15% based on the population versus the death. Compared to any other age range, for instance, your 75 to 84, they never even hit the 5% mark. What this tells us is that our hypothesis was correct and that the 65 plus age group is more vulnerable. So, what we may need to do when we are staffing nurses is pay attention to the 10 states to determine where we need to send nurses, since those seem to be the states where our elderly patients are seeing more of a decline due to influenza. This page is going to be based on our staff requirements that we'll need to send the nurses to each state. And as you may be surprised to know, most states don't have a mandatory nurse to patient ratio in the United States. Only 2 states actually have mandatory nurse to patient ratios, and that's going to be California and Massachusetts. From the forums and data that I looked into, a lot of nurses agreed that a 1 to 4 ratio for general patients is very manageable for their workload on a daily basis, and to 1 to 2 ratio is going to be good for them for critical care patients since they require more care. The graph at the bottom is going to show you the total influenza deaths from 2009 to 2017 per state. If you remember, we kind of had a similar graph or bar chart a few slides back, but this one's a little bit different because if you hover on the bars themselves, it tells you what state it is, along with just the total influenza death totals per year. So you'll see to the right of this bar chart, I have a filter. So right now that filter is on 2009. And I have for California, because that's the highest one, as you can see based on the bar chart, it has 6,200 deaths for influenza back in 2009. If I move it up to 2010, it changes, and now you can see that the death total for California went down, but it's still the highest at 5,732 deaths for influenza for 2010 for California. And of course, so on and so forth as you move that icon up or down. The chart or the spatial map at the top is going to show you the average nursing staff needed per state. The other chart showed you it is color coded for each state. The lighter colors mean that less nursing staff is needed for that state, and the darker colors are going to show you that more nursing staff is needed for that state. So, since we've been talking about California, I will focus more on that state just as an example. California is the darkest state because they have more deaths as we've seen in the past. So when I hover over the state of California, it will show me the state name as well as the max nurses needed for that state. And it tells you that 816 nurses are needed. Now, that is not just over 1 month. We have determined that that is over the peak influenza time period. So remember from our first slide, that is going to be from the beginning of October when it starts getting cold all the way to the end of March when the influenza season is starting to decline. How I came up with these numbers was with an analytical background of doing some different formulas in my Excel spreadsheet. Was I took the number that you may see over here in the bar chart to the left, so I'm going to go back to 2009, and you'll see for California, once again, there were 6,261 deaths. So what I did was I took the number of deaths for that state and the year, and I divided it by 4 because if you remember, 4 is the number of patients that nurses said is an adequate number for them to have a manageable workload. For every state and year that it had data, which would have been from 2009 all the way to 2017, we took the max number for each one of those years, and that is how you get the max number of nurses that we believe that we may need for each state. Now, of course, California has the highest amount of nurses possibly needed at 816. But if you hover over any of these lighter colored states, which means they don't need as many nurses, in Idaho, for instance, we only need 24 for the whole peak influenza season. And of course, it could be more or less depending on how that season fares. But from what we're thinking, we may only need 24. Wyoming, on the other hand, only needs 6. And once again, that can go up or down depending on the information. A limitation to this data would be that we'd have no information for Washington, D.C. or for Alaska, which is why you don't see Alaska on this map. So for those states, we'd have to figure out a different representation of how many nurses they would need for their influenza season. In conclusion, I want to go back to the hypothesis, which if you remember, we want to know if the age group of 65 plus is more vulnerable to influenza deaths than any other age group, preferably being those under 65. And we did prove that as correct. So if you remember that line chart, the red line is for 85 plus years. If I go down, that's going to be 75 to 84. And then you can see the green is going to be your 65 to 74, which all of those are going to be higher than the other numbers that you see or other lines that you see below them. The green, the blue, and the red in itself are higher than the others, even though the green is closer to the 64 and under age groups that we are trying to prove incorrect. I also want to point out the CDC graph that we had in the first slide, where they are pointing out the peak influenza months being from October to April. And they also focus on those winter months being from December to March. So that is when we would definitely need to send out the most nursing staffs to those different states to make sure those influenza patients that come in at that point in time are adequately cared for along with the other patients. And just looking at this average nursing staff needed per state once more, we just want to make sure that we look at how many nurses are needed for each state. As you see, if you hover over any state in this United States map, it gives an estimate of how many nurses will be needed for each state for the influenza season that's to come. Of course, this can be adjusted with our biweekly to monthly meetings and determining what states need more or even less nurses for that time frame, and that can be discussed in those meetings. So, thank you for your time, and I hope you have a great day.